Hello and welcome to this video on why it is gas and liquids behave in a very similar way, that is when they flow. Fundamentally, liquids and gases are defined by the following features. Gases have very widely separated molecules, they have a lot of kinetic energy in them, but this is far greater than the attractive forces keeping them widely apart. There isn't much in the way of significant attractive forces, meaning that they always expand inside a container, and that they exhibit non-ideal behaviour. Liquids, on the other hand, have intermolecular forces that attract them to each other and hold them close together. They are generally more dense and less compressible than gases, but can be made both more dense and compressed. Liquids have a definite volume, and that is independent of whatever container you put them in, and that the attractive forces, in liquids at least, well, most liquids, are not strong enough to keep the molecules in a fixed position. For the majority of this video, the important thing to note from these is that both states of matter have significant gaps between the molecules, admittedly more so in gas than liquids, but still. These gaps allow for the molecules to move relatively freely. This means that both states of matter have the ability to flow, and why you can consider both a fluid in that technical regard. Flow refers to the movement of particles of matter. You can find that both liquid and gas are able to flow as that big space between each molecule, and the lack of strong enough attractive forces means that those molecules can move past each other. When you compare this to something like a solid, they're generally so tightly attracted to each other that they can't move at all. The thing we pointed out with gases in particular, and that is that they both exhibit non-ideal behavior and that there's a lack of any significant attractive forces, means that a gas will expand to fill whatever you put it in, whereas a liquid will not. This is why a gas can have much lower pressure in a larger container than an equivalent volume of liquid if you were to put it in the same size larger container. You can pressurize both gases and liquids, but not solids. As you pressurize gases and liquids, you encounter more resistance as it pushes back. This is important in vessels, whether it's pipes, hoses, arteries, and balloons, or anything else you can think of. No matter which, as you try to push more liquid or gas through a small vessel, it increases in pressure. That is because you are trying to move the same amount of fluid or gas, but through a small space. If you were to make that size of the vessel smaller again, you would increase pressure, or make it larger, you would decrease pressure. To compensate for shrinking the size of a vessel, more speed is needed. When you increase the flow rate and speed, you increase resistance. This resistance is generated by turbulence and friction. For the most part, we'll just focus on turbulence in this video, so bear in mind that friction is another factor to consider, but it's also something that will vary a great deal more than turbulence will. The reason we focus on turbulence and consider it the more important is that there's a great deal more similarity. As already described, fluids and gases in a closed, or perhaps better to say limited environment, will encounter the barriers or walls of the environment. This leads to it bouncing back from the walls and reflected in random ways. That random rebound creates turbulence. Turbulence has the molecules ricocheting around and hitting each other. This is not good. The interactions lead to the energy being transferred or transformed into heat. This leads to the turbulence being worn down over time as the kinetic energy is lost to transformation. This is why you don't get continuous turbulence being made. What we want to focus on is whether it's a gas or a liquid, the flow and the resulting turbulence will be considered either laminar or turbulent flow. Laminar flow is where the molecules flow in clean, neat layers. That is without any turbulence to speak of, or at least not significant turbulence. This is generally something that occurs at a low pressure and flow rate. Turbulent flow is the other option we need to describe, and it's not ordered at all. In fact, you can almost think of it as being more akin to what happens with magnets, where you have many small magnets. each of them individually interacts with the others, causing many individual pockets and changes of what's going on. This means that everything gets mixed together and you don't have a great deal of control over it. Laminar flow is smooth and therefore you don't need to worry about this. The turbulent flow ends up with everything being mixed together, and it's caused by the excess of kinetic energy in the fluid or gas. And this is enough to overwhelm anything that would be counteracting it. For example, you might have a very dense gas, or you could have a very dense liquid. And normally this would be enough to at least mitigate some of the effect of kinetic energy, but not always, and especially if the kinetic energy is far greater than what the viscosity of whatever it is allows for. In general terms, you're more concerned about turbulent flow than you are laminar flow. And the reason you're worried about turbulent flow is that it creates vortices, or let's say chaos, which can cause damage to blood vessels, damage to pipes and pumps and more. That's because they increase friction. They also increase other things that occur, for example, inflammation in humans. That means you need more energy and more effort, not only to move the, let's say, blood through arteries, because some of it's circulating back on itself and increasing the resistance. Or if you're trying to pump something uphill, you now need to counteract the force of it pushing back down against the pump, along with the effect of gravity, meaning you need a much bigger pump head height than you would otherwise. And to be clear, this is a very broad oversimplification and explanation of not just why it is that gas and water behave remarkably similar in instances of something like a blood vessel or pipe, but a very specific focus on turbulence and how turbulence is important in how it generates not only greater friction resistance, but can to some extent lead to damage as a result. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.